What makes a story complex? When you think of a complex story, you might equate it to being a culmination of its plot, themes, and characters. But what if I told you that there was a series that forewent the first part of that? Sonny Boy is one of the most unique series I've gone through. It's an extremely simple story, but you'll never fully understand it. And that's okay. But why is that? What's it about? And what's the purpose of living? No? Too dark? We'll get to that. Maybe. Sonny Boy follows Nagara, a middle schooler who's on the brink of graduating and heading into high school. He's passive, doesn't really contribute all that much to society, and is basically a nobody in the eyes of the world. Think of Mob minus the world-shattering powers, and honestly, even worse on the mental side. The story starts in a classroom where the students find themselves in an alternate world where the laws of the universe are similar, yet very different. The world around them is a void, and some people have found themselves with the ability to use superpowers, while others are forced to come to terms with their own insignificance. It's a place where they're forced to face both their greatest fears and desires. From existentialism to the dynamics of power and faith, each episode explores a completely different theme. It takes its time going through these points, challenging its viewers to really think, and so if you do watch this series, I highly recommend watching it more than once to fully grasp what it's trying to say. If you can understand a story within one watch through, that obviously makes it simple. However, that doesn't mean it's a bad series, let's make that clear. But because this anime is easily the most complex one I've gone through so far, I do not recommend it to anyone who holds the belief that art can be pretentious. I may not personally think this is by definition pretentious, but I can understand where people are coming from. It's an autorial piece of work, and so you'll either love it or absolutely hate it. There is basically no in between. Not only can it be extremely confusing, but the pacing is unconventional, which is very obviously intended so that we can progress through different points that happen in the background instead of focusing on the journey right in front of us. It's amazing and honestly some of the best work I've seen in recent years, but it is not for everyone. If you're a fan of series that dive headfirst into philosophy and are incredibly nuanced, like Serial Experiments Lane, FLCL, or even Evangelion, you'll love this series. If you dislike these things, stay the fuck away. There are a million other shows you can watch that dive into these types of subjects without feeling so outlandish and having more standard pacing. I recommend Mob Psycho for having a similar reoccurring theme, whilst being a lot easier to digest. And hey, if you want to watch my video on Mob Psycho, feel free to check it out. Just slow it down by 25%. I may or may not have had a lot of caffeine. And cocaine. But let's talk about the art of this show. Simple shading does a lot for this story. It separates it from every other one I've seen and really helps us zone in on the characters. It creates a center of focus for us and cuts the fat out whilst being beautiful in its own way. From the clear blue sky to the unique world designs, the art just constantly proves that while technical skill is important, simplicity can be just as beautiful. Also, the movement of the characters being extremely human really adds onto that uncanny feeling that's present throughout the show, which just makes it even more genius than it already is. The music is, like the art, godly. The sound design is batshit insane, holy shit. Loon feels organic, like I'm in the room hearing a pianist play this bittersweet melody for me. It's the sound of melancholic acceptance, like there's something terribly wrong, but there's nothing I can do. But then we get to Spare, and it just, I don't know man, it just hits me in the feels. My second favorite track from this OST has got to be Broken Windows. I'm not going over my favorite track because it's Rhapsody, which, come on now, that's probably the most common favorite to have, let's be real. It has an insane amount of suspense, and it grabs you by the balls and just twists them. It felt like something that came out of Hans Zimmer himself, on top of the broken window part being a huge clue as to how abstract this show would end up being. We'll get to that later. There's not much else for me to say. It's all fire. Going forward, there will be spoilers, so go ahead and watch the series if you're interested. I mean, if you don't care to watch it, you can always stick around and listen to the philosophical rambling, but I highly recommend watching it. The experience of watching this show was otherworldly. Also, make sure to subscribe. We go over a bunch of different shows here and yap a ton. I'll start streaming on Twitch once I hit 10,000 subscribers, and hey, we're pretty damn close to that goal, so pay up. But without further ado, let's go over some of our cast, starting with our main character, Nagara. Throughout the series, Nagara is a pushover. He listens to everyone around him and very obviously views himself as nothing more than a cog in the machine of life. At first, his passive nature reflects his belief that his choices have no meaning. Why should he act when nothing seems to have a point? It's not until he meets Nozomi and connects with the people around him that he starts to change. Nagara's change is not a eureka moment, it's slow, messy, and incomplete, much like real personal growth, and even at the end, his character at its core is extremely similar to how he started. Many people are quick to criticize this, saying that this makes him bland or lacking in growth, however, this to me just makes him more realistic. 2 years isn't enough time for a complete change of identity. It's enough for small, subtle shifts in it, and the result is a person that you can still look at in the mirror and say that despite everything you've gone through over the course of time, it's still you. Media has this tendency to make characters have huge changes in short amounts of time, and while they keep the core part of their characters like their personalities, they're still going through massive changes quickly. It doesn't always take just one moment for someone's ideals to change. It takes repetitive action of that moment and the discipline to continue for real change to happen. Think of when you go to the gym. You lift weights, you get big, that's great. You do that for 2 years. Are you Mr. Olympia now? No! Are you going to get your pro card now? Maybe if you go on a cycle that would make Sam Sulek himself faint. It takes a seriously long amount of time to get to that point, and so in the grand scheme of things, the 2 years that Nagara spent in this world, while being eye-opening and extremely surreal, are not going to make him into a brand new person. Over time, Nagara begins to move away from his pessimistic attitude, gradually adopting a mindset closer to existentialism, with his first encounter with this philosophy stemming from Nozomi. Nagara witnesses a bird die in front of him, not just once, but twice. Logically, it made sense to not do anything. There was nothing he could do to save it after all, as he didn't know what he was supposed to do. However, Nozomi shifts his mindset throughout the series, encouraging him to take action even if it's just a small effort to try to save it. As illogical as it might have seemed in the moment, this small gesture would help nurture a philosophy that would stay with him forever, one where he's reminded that no matter how small of an action he takes, it should matter to him. Nagara's journey reminds us that change doesn't have to be dramatic to be thorough. To call him blind is to miss the point. He's a mirror for us, a reflection of our own struggles to grow, change, and live authentically. So, is true growth about changing who we are, or is it about learning to accept who we've always been? But let's talk about the person who changed his perspective on the world, Nozomi. Nozomi embodies Sonny Boy's recurring theme of individuality to a T. Her unwavering faith in the compass of light pushes her character and shapes how she acts. The light helps show truth and purpose both literally and figuratively. It's a force that goes against the rules and hierarchies the group clings to for order, which is shown when Nozomi takes the first leap of faith into the void despite everyone else's fears. Nozomi is a trailblazer, but more than that, is also a catalyst for Nagara's growth. Her belief in him inspires him to confront his insecurities and embrace his individuality. She challenges him to see the world as not black or white, but as a canvas where he's free to choose any color he deems appropriate. She defies authority, lives for herself, and pushes forward to do what she wants, not concerning herself with the ideas of others. Out of all the characters in the show, Nozomi is one of the most free. Despite all this, Nozomi is far from naive. She understands the cost of freedom. The loneliness and isolation that comes with reaching the summit are things that must exist when it comes to reaching the top in any field. Staying alongside others is always going to be the safer and more comforting option, but Nozomi lives to fulfill her desires, and so she never conforms to societal norms, despite the pain it brings. To Nozomi, that freedom is worth everything. Her pursuit of freedom ultimately costs her her life. She rejects the expectations of the people around her and lives on her own terms, but is it really worth it? Does the rejection of societal ideologies risk isolation, and does shining bright in this world actually matter at all? But we can't talk about Nozomi without bringing up Asakaze as well. Asakaze is an extremely immature yet relatable character. As someone who also struggled with maintaining my ego when I was younger, I found myself relating to his struggle pretty heavily. Throughout the series, Asakaze struggles with his desire for validation, and as such he finds ways to leverage his powers over other people. He's given world-shattering powers, and yet he remains unsatisfied throughout the entire show. There's an unfillable void in his heart, and because his philosophy lacks the depth of others like Nagara or Nozomi, he's far more volatile and fragile. Asakaze's journey is, at its core, a tragedy of missed opportunities. Early on, he gets close to following a path of redemption where he slowly but reluctantly begins to accept that his powers don't define him. He admits that while he's talented, he's no better than others, and there are certainly people more talented than him. It's a moment of growth, albeit one that feels reluctant. But true change takes time, and Asakaze never gets the opportunity to come to this realization. Before this mindset can really settle in, Aki preys on his insecurities, feeding into his ego and dragging him back down. He goes back to considering himself a special one, and we see him ostracize himself from the rest of the group. Under Aki's manipulation, Asakaze regresses into believing he is special, chosen by God. This idea of being God's chosen one is something that Nozomi doesn't agree with, as it shackles you to God's will. This leaves Asakaze in a place of solitude, with only Aki being the one to reaffirm his stance in all of this, despite it being blatant manipulation to further her own goals. Side tangent, I do think that Aki is supposed to represent the devil. I mean, shit, look at the badonkers. That's clearly meant to signify lust on top of her snake-like features, which, you know, Garden of Eden and all that blah blah blah. It would explain why she knew of Kosetsu's mind-reading abilities and why she continuously drags Asakaze back down to a ruined mental state on top of knowing all of his insecurities. Back on topic. Because of this, Asakaze goes from being a character who defies authority to becoming a prisoner to God. He blindly follows the two of them because he's been fed a false narrative of being the chosen one, and so this only drives the rift between Nozomi and him even further. What's the purpose of strength if you lack the willpower to defy those who control you? What value is there in seeking external validation when you cannot first accept yourself? And most tragically, what does it mean to be the strongest if all it does is amplify your isolation? On the topic of isolation, let's talk about the character who intentionally distanced themselves from the rest of society. Mizuho is another character whose philosophy revolves around self-reliance and defying societal expectations, but her approach is a lot more different from others in the story. Mizuho is perceived at the beginning as antisocial, viewing dependence on others as a weakness. Her actions stem from a belief in staying strong on her own, avoiding confrontation and opting to express her frustrations indirectly rather than directly standing up to others. However, this is more of an act of self-preservation rather than being antisocial. This mindset is rooted in her upbringing in a traditional household that burdened her with high expectations and demanded she conform to its ideals. Throughout her life, she carried the weight of someone her family wanted her to be. The one exception to this was a teacher who, as far as we can speculate, accepted Mizuho for who she truly was. However, this person was removed from her life, likely due to challenging the people that vindicated her. While the exact nature of their relationship is left ambiguous to say the least, the teacher's departure confirmed Mizuho's belief that standing out or relying on others only leads to disappointment. As the saying goes, the nail that sticks out is the one that gets hammered down. Early in the series, Mizuho's distrust of others is evident in her view of Nagara as weak and unreliable, reinforcing her commitment to self-reliance. However, as she spends more time with Nagara and Nozomi, her outlook begins to shift. She quietly observes Nagara's persistence in the face of adversity and his growing strength inspired by Nozomi's courage and individuality. Over time, these two challenge her perspective, creating doubt about whether her path of isolation is what she truly wants. Slowly but surely, Mizuho begins to open up and form deeper connections with the people around her. Is sticking out the right thing to do even if it means being hammered back down, and in order for someone to be individual, does it, ironically, require someone else to be present? Rajdhani is the GOAT of this series. Oh my god, what a breath of fresh air. In a series where everyone else is freaking out and going at each other's throats while getting into crazy religious spirals, it's nice to have a character who remains calm, collected, but more importantly, positive. I'd say out of all the characters in this series, Rajdhani was easily my favorite. He's confident in what he does, curious about this world, and he truly embodies existentialism. It's because everything around him is falling apart that he decides to take the time to study and do what he can. He exercises patience, views others' opinions as important, and prioritizes the pursuit of knowledge and survival. While many people around him fall into despair, Rajdhani, who, let's be real, has the most potential in the normal world, does not. He doesn't spend his days stressing about what's going on at home. Instead, he embraces that this is where he is here and now, finding beauty in the world around him through discovery and the endless possibilities awaiting him. He prioritizes his own feelings in this way too, and so by extension, proves that he is the most individually free character in this series. He's what we should all aspire to be. Unlike many of the characters who experience emotional or philosophical growth, Rajdhani is just built different. Even after 2,000 years in this world, Rajdhani remains the same. He's an anchor that shows how despite everything that's occurred, not all people lose themselves in the chaos. At the end of the series, Rajdhani doesn't return home with Mizuho and Nagara. I mean, you can't really, it's been 2,000 years in this world, so going back home isn't really an option anymore, as we've heard from Yamabiko. But even if he could go back home, it would most definitely not feel like home to him anymore. This world is a place of infinite probabilities. It's a place where he's free to explore what he wants without the constraints of reality, and so to a character like Rajdhani, it's perfect. To him, this is home. And it's beautiful. Now I'd like to bring your attention to another character who tries to do what Rajdhani does, but through the act of devotion to God. Hoshi is a character who starts off as someone who follows the ideals of determinism, specifically of the theological kind, but as we continue going through his story, it changes into one of individualism. Throughout the series, Hoshi acts as a prophet for the group, a figure chosen by God to guide the class. This role creates a philosophical conflict, particularly with Asakaze. While Asakaze wields power through brute force, Hoshi's authority stems from his unshakable belief in God and his reliance on knowledge as power. Hoshi takes steps to keep the classroom sane. He consistently tries to find a middle ground for everyone to stand on before giving out his orders. It's a similar but different approach to Rajdhani's. Rajdhani uses evidence and scientific reasoning to come to conclusions, whereas Hoshi relies on his faith in God and uses it to gain power within this small-scale society. This creates even more doubts in his peers, as even though Hoshi hasn't ever been wrong, to put your trust in something as divine but unknown as God is just asking for fear to begin to settle in. Not only this, but Hoshi's act of bringing regulations to the classroom is actually symbolically shown through the broken windows theory. In the first episode, Hoshi establishes order by creating rules to stop the students from breaking more windows with their powers. The theory behind the broken windows is that if people see a place in disarray, or in this case, broken windows, it incites crime, seeing as nobody actually respects where they're at. Just from this small gesture, we're able to witness Hoshi's need for an organized society even in times of dire need, and we're also able to see how much Hoshi disagrees with Asakaze's ideas of brute force. Ironically, Hoshi, the one who trusted God the most, ultimately defies him by taking his own life, at least as far as we're concerned. In the beginning, Hoshi was unrelenting in his choices, following God's guidance without question. Over time, however, cracks began to form in his faith. He started questioning his role and, by the end, chose to live for himself, breaking free from the mental prison of blind faith. His freedom resulted in his death and the suffering of the others around him, but at the end of it all, the world had gone into stasis, so to Hoshi, none of that really mattered to him. He did what he wanted, and his selfishness was successful. He escaped this world on his own terms, and because of that, Rajdhani would even come to idolize him. To fall from grace was Hoshi's final act of retribution to God. Hoshi breaking free from his fate of being a prophet of blind faith brought suffering to everyone else around him. But does defying your destiny and asserting individuality justify the harm it causes? To Hoshi, and by extension Rajdhani, those costs were more than worth it. But let's talk about a character who accepted their fate instead, albeit through a more depressing journey. Yamabiko is a character who's filled with lots of regrets, and yet he presses on, accepting that what's done is done. He's a character who doesn't cling to his humanity like the others. I mean, he's a dog, so he's quite literally not human anymore. Yamabiko's philosophy revolves around the seeking of redemption and his purpose in this world. He failed to save Kodama, and so he puts it on himself to do better and help those around him, specifically Nagara and Mizuho. He gives them insight on the world and offers them guidance without trying to force his perspective on them like some of the other characters do. Looking at you, Asakaze and Hoshi. Not only that, but Yamabiko was a dog, and we all know what dogs are symbolism for, so I won't yap about it. I'm really only saying this so I can ignore that one dumbass comment that thinks that they're smarter than the rest of my audience. Yamabiko has spent thousands of years alone, so to see him be at peace with his fate and find his purpose within Nagara and Mizuho was touching. He's a character who continues to push forward despite his suffering, showing Nagara and Mizuho that no matter how tough it gets in this world, to stay on their feet and continue their journey. Yamabiko may never know it, but he's become far more like his mentor than he could ever imagine. If you could undo your greatest regret, would it lead to a better life, or would it simply create new regrets? And can we ever fully atone for our past mistakes, or is it enough to simply just keep moving forward? Due to how insanely packed this series is, I won't be going over every single episode, as that would take forever. So instead, I'm just going to be focusing on some key points in the plot that were intriguing to me. Maybe in the future I'll get to analyzing each and every single episode, but for now, I'd like to bring your attention towards The Great Monkey Baseball, easily one of the greatest and most open-ended episodes of this series. Monkey Baseball is genius. The story is about monkeys learning how to play baseball and taking it as seriously as the fucking MLB. It spirals into chaos as the umpire monkey holds his stance on upholding the rules, resulting in the umpire monkey's death. On the surface, it might sound bizarre and somewhat comedic even due to the absurdity of it, but in reality, this entire story perfectly encapsulates the idea of finding meaning in chaos. The umpire's death is meaningless, it doesn't change the result of his call, and his call-out didn't change the result of the game either. It was just to uphold the rules, and so it, by all means, is a pointless endeavor, making the umpire out to be a sort of idiot head who doesn't seem to follow any sort of logic. However, that couldn't be further from the truth. The umpire lived and died honorably. He showed fairness and didn't crumble under the weight of societal expectations. He could have let blues throw count. It was off by such a slight amount in the end that it didn't really matter, but he chose not to because that would go against his code of honor. While everyone else seems to find Blue amazing due to him being a star in the league, Nozomi finds the umpire to be the most outstanding character in the story. Blue might be extremely talented, but he wanted to forego the rules out of selfishness, whereas the umpire understood that even if it was only a millimeter, even a nanometer off, it would be a foul. The umpire stood his ground against the world and didn't falter, dying as a martyr. He was never shackled by the world. He lived and died on his own terms. This is all told through the lens of Cap, and so there aren't many visual cues for this. It's a rare case where telling but not showing actually makes it so much better. The story is left up to our imagination. The brutality of the Umpire's death and the rage of Blue is never shown, and so that makes it all the more ambiguous. Because of this, Nagara decides to actually take a swing at Ace's throw. He finally understands what the Umpire's mindset was, and so from this, he takes his first big step in the direction of existentialism. He might not be able to hit that pitch, he might be way off for all he knows, but it doesn't matter. All that matters is that he gives it a shot, and after his monologue, Nagara swings, and he misses. Yet despite that, the world cheers for him and Ace breaks down. By all accounts, the winner should be celebrating, yet at this moment, Ace knew that he lost. Nagara found meaning in this pointless action. Nagara, a character who's been so downtrodden the entire time, felt fulfillment in failure. For the first time in his life, Nagara felt free to do what he wanted, not what made sense. He didn't run away, he didn't sit there and accept his inevitable fate. He fought against the current and grew from his failures with one single swing. I don't really have a segue for this. Let's talk about Nozomi's death. Nozomi's death is sudden. It's not climactic. It's not going out with a bang. It's uncannily realistic. Asakaze doesn't save Nozomi at this moment because at this point, he's become more distant. His reaction to it contradicts this point slightly. However, at the same time, Asakaze has been a character who acts one way but thinks the opposite. Nozomi has rejected him for the final time. She's told him her final goodbye, and so to someone as egotistical and insecure as Asakaze, she's now useless in his eyes. His brain might be screaming at him to save her, but his heart doesn't want to, and so he lets her fall. This point is further reinforced by the fact that Kosetsu says that she thought she knew Asakaze, but after witnessing this moment, she comes to the conclusion that she actually has no idea. You can understand someone's brain, but to understand the human spirit requires something else entirely. It takes a long time for Nagara to actually come to terms with Nozomi's death, and for me personally, I didn't even process it till we saw her in the normal world again, which just makes it feel even more real. Death doesn't always hit us immediately. It usually takes its time to settle in, and it's through the little reminders that we notice what we've truly lost. It's not until we see her again that we realize that while it's Nozomi, it's not the same Nozomi we know. This, to our knowledge, and by extension Nagara, is a completely different person. They don't fully meet each other again, and Nagara breaks the promise he made with Nozomi for them to reunite, showcasing that despite his growth, he still can't fully come to accept the idea of doing things for the sake of wanting to, and not because it logically makes sense. He can't go back. What's happened has happened. The Nozomi he met back in this world is gone forever. And that shit hurts. Speaking of the real world, let's talk about Mizuho and Nagara's escape from this world. I am obligated to do so. This was gorgeous. My brain was melting watching this sequence, but the build up to this moment was incredible. Nagara and Mizuho are in a world that, while it's in stasis, actually suits them better. They're both social outcasts and are probably the last people that would want to go home, but ironically they're the only ones that do. Seeing God try to tell them to stop only for them to keep going and ignore his words was amazing, and something tells me God was proud of them in this moment too. God as a character has been extremely ambiguous with his motives being unknown, but seeing him sit back and let them move forward without interference shows that there's no actual fate chaining any of the characters down. The characters are free to do as they please, and God proves that in this moment. Not a single person in this show had a preordained destiny. They were just given guidance. Watching Mizuho run forward with Nagara in front helps showcase Nagara's willingness to go home. Throughout the show, Nagara has been accused multiple times of being the one to cause the drifting, and yet out of everyone, he's the one who wants to go home the most. Mizuho struggling to keep up in this moment could be to signify her reluctance to return home. Back at home, her cats have passed on, she's hated and has nobody around her. Here she has her cats, Rajdhani, Nagara, and powers that let her exist by herself. Here she's the ultimate form of capitalism, and so going home would require her to work for everything. This world is her own personal heaven, and so why should she go home? Because it's reality. And as Nagara grabs her hand, Mizuho accepts that this is the correct decision. It might be useless to go home, it might not make sense, hell it might even be detrimental to her, but it's still the choice she makes. To live in comfort is to live in stasis, and living in that sort of escapism is hell to her whether she knows it or not. Nagara doesn't end up with Nozomi, which while heartbreaking is realistic. However, Nagara doesn't take any offense to this. He's moved on, he's accepted that he can't ever go back to the way it was before, and at the end of it all, he still carries on with a smile, acknowledging that despite the fact that he's gone through such an insane journey, his life is just beginning. He's not alone in this world. Everything he saw did happen, and nothing's going to change that. You may not be able to make any sort of change in this world. Everything you do might be for nothing, but at the end of the day, do you feel fulfilled? Was it worth it? Did it bring meaning to your life? It doesn't matter. The universe is incomprehensibly massive, the thoughts and expectations of the people around you are unfathomably complex, and the sands of time will never stop flowing, so why worry about judgment? Why should you and I waste our time with the concerns of the world when we're just one of trillions throughout history? We're never going to last forever. Our names will eventually become a passing memory to even the ones closest to us, but that's okay, because through nothingness we find freedom. Through the disappearance of expectations, we find ourselves, not the person the world wants us to be. You and I are nothing, and that's beautiful.
もう一回友達になろうってね、約束。